Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gwen Robinson, past president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand and editor-at-large of Nikkei Asia. And welcome to one of our rare lunchtime talks. It's great to see a bit of a turnout. I think it's a great little format. We often do things in the evening, but we were very fortunate to have Jeff Wasserstrom today in Bangkok, and the scheduling worked out this way. So we're here, as you know, to hear Jeff, who's the author of the recently published book Vigil, Hong Kong on the Brink. I'm holding it up here. It is apparently available, well, we're not sure, but we think it's available in bookstores here. It's a very slim little volume, so if you're interested. He's also written many other books, but he can tell you about those later. Jeff is going to talk briefly, and then we'll take some Q&A and wrap it up probably by at the latest 2 o'clock. So just let me tell you, say a few words about Jeff. This is drawn largely from his own description. Jeff is Chancellor's Professor of History at the University of California, Irvine, and describes himself as a specialist in modern Chinese history with a strong interest in connecting China's past to its present and placing both into a global perspective. With an enduring interest in protest movements, particularly in the urban context, he wrote many of his books with an eye to engaging with not just historians, but also scholars in other disciplines and also general readers. And as seen in his book Vigil, he's extended his involvement and research, including to documentary filmmakers and general interest publications, reviews and commentaries for magazines such as Time, The Nation, the TLS, and newspapers, LA Times, Wall Street Journal, FT, etc., and online publications from the Huffington Post to the online edition of The Atlantic, and has worked with literary festivals, including the Hong Kong International Literary Festival. He's on the editorial board of Dissent magazine and is both advising editor for China for the LA Review of Books and the founder of its China channel. He was educated largely in California at Berkeley with a master's from Harvard and moved back to California to join UCI's history department in 2006. So with that, I will hand over to Jeff, who today, I believe, will expand beyond just Hong Kong and discuss some of his latest research, which is kind of joining the dots on what we know broadly or loosely as the Milk Tea Alliance, the rise of youth protest movements in both Southeast and North Asia. So, Jeff, over to you.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Gwen, for making this possible. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this happen. And I was planning to come here. This is an experimental research trip. I'm just really becoming interested in Thailand, and I'm trying to figure out how connected, how seriously we should take the different kinds of connections between what's happened in Hong Kong in the 2010s and then into the 2020s, and what's happened in Thailand and in Myanmar. And the term Milk Tea Alliance was brought up as a way of connecting these struggles. And what I'm curious about is the way in which events in different parts of the world can become connected and need to be thought about as connected. And I think this can take a variety of forms. The term Milk Tea Alliance can suggest something more formal than part of what's happening. But I think if we think about it in the way that a variety of things that will resonate with people of different ages, particularly might think about things. We had, when I was growing up in the 1960s, there was an idea that there was something happening with youth in different parts of the world, and people would talk about like 60s protests. And in some cases, it turned out that the movements had very little to do with each other and very little in common in terms of their goals, but they might share certain shared symbols that gave a kind of connectedness to them. And at the time when things were being shown on television, the new media of the time, people would pick up on and watch what somebody was doing in another part of the world. And so even if the grievances, even if the goals were not similar at all, there would be a sense of connectedness through shared grammars of protest or through shared symbols. One of the most obvious cases of this was, I think, the first time I became aware of China as a site of protest, and something that would eventually become my career when I was a kid, was seeing Mao's Red Book. And Mao's Little Red Book was being used by groups in the United States that had very little connection to Mao, but maybe thought of what they were doing was somehow similar to the Red Guards, but yet had obviously nothing much to do with it. So I've always been interested in the back of my mind at the way in which there can either be very important connections between different movements, and there can also be ways in which there's just a kind of a sharing of maybe a tactic or sharing of a symbol. And so I know that we can say with the Milk Tea Alliance, there clearly is a shared symbol that has showed up in each of these settings, the three-finger Hunger Games salute. So we know there's been an effective spread of that. We know that there's been a spread of some tactics used in Hong Kong in 2019, ways of dealing with tear gas, an emphasis on a leaderless movement, the mantra, be water. And this is something that has spread to different parts of Asia, but parts of that repertoire have spread to other parts of the world, but others haven't. So the Hunger Games salute hasn't taken off didn't take off in Belarus, but some ideas of the be water strategy was used. So anyway, I think this is something to try to explore, and there's actually a way in which academics tend to be trained to study one or another part of the world, particularly historians. They know a language, they want to work on the place where they know the language. So sometimes they miss the connections between these different things, but also sometimes they overstate, or journalists overstate as well, the connection between places. So this is a kind of probing of how does this work. There was one quite specific way in which the Hong Kong story and the Thai story became connected in my mind quite early, which was that I started following the Hong Kong story closely in 2014. Joshua Wong, who had become a leader in 2012, was important. After the umbrella movement of 2014, there was an effort to bring Joshua Wong to speak in Bangkok, and he was blocked from entering, presumably because of pressure from the Chinese government. There was an effort then he then spoke via Skype. There were connections between him and a local activist who then published a translation of Joshua Wong's work. So there was clearly a connection there, a sense of shared purpose, even though the movements were very different in their goals, but there was a sense of some kind of kinship. And then the blocking of him from coming here, presumably under Chinese pressure, cemented a sense of commonness. And so I'll just give the one other chance to promote Vigil some more. Thank you, Gwen, for promoting it. But there's only one foreign language edition of Vigil out. I assumed that it might be translated into Chinese and published in Taiwan. I assumed when I was writing it, it might be translated into Chinese and published in Hong Kong. But then the book came out early in 2020 at a time soon after that. There was no way it would be published in Chinese in Hong Kong. Though interestingly, until recently, and perhaps even now, it's available in English in Hong Kong, because the Chinese Communist Party has always given more latitude to what can be published in English than can be published in Chinese. In 2019, when I was in Hong Kong doing research for this, I wanted to buy Joshua Wong's book, Unfree Speech, that at that point was only out in Chinese. And it was very hard to find a Chinese language copy of it. I had to go to a very obscure bookstore before I found it, because some of the bookstores that had connections to the mainland were no longer stocking it. There was a story that made news when Joshua Wong's Chinese language edition of Unfree Speech was taken off the shelves of libraries in 2020, but the book was still actually for sale for a time in English in Hong Kong. But so there's been no Chinese language edition of Vigil out, but there is a Thai language edition of Vigil out, published by Samyan Press, which had a connection to the effort to bring Joshua Wong over, and it's published in the same kind of series as works by Joshua Wong, but also works on civil disobedience in totally other parts of the world. The press translates Václav Havel into Thai, Nelson Mandela, a kind of collection of people who are seen as kind of inspirational figures. And I think that's one way that movements can be connected, even if they don't have sort of a formal alliance, a formal movement. One thing we might ask is, do they borrow symbols from each other? Do they have shared models? Do they have shared people that they're emulating? And the only thing I've written in Thai was translated into Thai. I wrote a preface to the Thai edition in which I talked about one of the connections was that as the clampdown in Hong Kong has gone through, there's been increased interest in reading Václav Havel, somebody who was part of a movement that was crushed, that remained and tried to think of ways that you could keep a spirit of a movement alive that seemed to have faced impossible odds and been crushed. And it's a hopeful story if you focus on Havel, because 20 years after the movement he was part of in 1968 was completely crushed, it then was reborn in a new guise, and he ended up being president of the country. So my own road into studying protest, I was taken to some protests as a child of a family that was protesting the Vietnam War. So I could say that my first engagement with protest had something to do with Southeast Asia. Went to anti-war protests. But my first intellectual engagement was as a graduate student in the 1980s. I did my dissertation on Shanghai student movements of the pre-1949 period. Largely anti-imperialist movements that are celebrated as great patriotic events in China when you're under the Communist Party, because these are some events that the 1919 protests, the first in this sort of series, were ones that some future founders of the Chinese Communist Party took part in. And then some later ones were against the Nationalist Party, the Communist Party's rival. Many of them were against Japanese imperialism. And so I did this work on trying to figure out, how do people get onto the streets? What do they do once they get there? How do they have a shared sense of what to do when they're on the street? Something that scholars of social movements refer to as a repertoire of protest. That how do people have a sense of what a demonstration should look like, or what a slogan should be like, and how do they borrow and learn from each other? So when I did that, my dissertation that then became a book about the Shanghai protests of 1919 to 1949, I was very interested in the transmission of protest patterns from within one city, from one generation to another. And that's something I think that would resonate with people focused on Thailand, where there have been successive generations of protesters from the 70s through the 90s to the present, that both are aware of what's happened before and trying to draw some inspiration from it. If you're at a university that was important in an earlier movement, you often will have take a special pride in your university being important in a movement that's seen as part of that same trajectory. When I was in Shanghai doing research for this protest, this dissertation about pre-1949 protests, a new round of protests broke out. Not the Tiananmen protests, but the lead up to the Tiananmen protests in 1986. There were students who took to the streets protesting, wanting to speed up the reform process to increase liberalization. And they had been schooled in what students at their university, the university I was at, Fudan University, they were schooled in what students had done, like where the march routes were, what you did when there was a protest. They had been schooled in the pre-1949 protests that the state and the textbooks celebrated. Students had also been involved in the Cultural Revolution protests, but those were not celebrated. Those were seen as a break, but they were schooled in these earlier movements. And in fact, in 1986, when they began to march, it was right around the anniversary of one of the great pre-1949 movements, the December 9th movement. And there were billboards up around the school put up by the official organizations saying, remember what the students of 1935 from Fudan did to prove their patriotism. They marched here, they marched there, they put up posters on campus. The students in 1986 started saying, well, we want to do something for the good of the nation, so we're going to do what they did. And they put up their own posters sort of on top of the posters that were about what had happened before. So I was interested in this transmission through time, but I was also interested in what at that time was a kind of hidden part of it, but is more relevant to the Milk Tea Alliance, which is that there were some signs in that, as back in the 19-teens, of an awareness of what people in other parts of Asia were doing about shared concerns. So the 1919 protests, the May 4th movement in China, which is the most celebrated of the early 20th century Chinese student movements, patriotic movements. It was against the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, that was the end of World War I, that was dividing up former colonial territories, doing away with German holdings around the world, but allowing Japan to extend its imperial reach. So Chinese students were very angry because former German territories in China, Shandong province, were being passed on from German control to Japanese control rather than being given back to Chinese control, even though China had come in on the side of the Allies, as had Japan. During the May 4th movement, this was a national movement. It's usually studied just within the context of Chinese history. There was a protest also triggered by the fact that Japanese colonialism was going on in Korea at almost exactly the same time. The March 1st movement, one of the most celebrated of Korean patriotic movements. Students and others in Korea took to the streets to say, now that World War I, which is supposed to give an end to imperialism, is over, shouldn't Japan be pressured to stop its colonial project in Korea? There was a small theme in the Chinese protests in Shanghai where some students would say to each other, we need to take to the streets to show our patriotism and our bravery. How could we live with ourselves if we didn't? When in Korea, which is fully colonized, and there's so much more danger to take to the streets, protesters there have protested against Japanese imperialism. Surely we should do the same. So it wasn't that the movements were derivative, but there was a kind of shared sense of concern. And in fact, there were protests in 1919 around the same time in India and in Egypt, all shared by this sense of a kind of common threat, a common concern to try to free their countries from external control. So this is something that, as I say, historians tend to focus on one country or another country. So it's a very minor part of the national story. But actually, if you pull back and think about it in terms of these kinds of connections, a book came out called The Wilsonian Moment by a scholar who's put these different movements side by side and looked at how different people struggling against imperialism and colonialism in different parts of the world were connecting with each other through meeting each other in Paris. Ho Chi Minh was in Paris. Some of the future founders of the Chinese Communist Party were in Paris. There were leaders of anti-colonial movements from Africa. They were connected through sites where deals were being worked out. They were connected through anti-imperialist leagues. And they were then connected later by Moscow and the Comintern, trying to connect people with these kinds of shared things. One thing that connected activists across Asia in the early 20th century was a dislike for Western imperialism, and then also a dislike of Japanese imperialism. As I started to be interested in the Milk Tea Alliance and the sort of aftermath of the Hong Kong protests, as Hong Kongers being crushed in Hong Kong, the movement being crushed. The diaspora became increasingly important, with people going outside of Hong Kong, and the story of Hong Kong tactics or connections to people in Southeast Asia became more interesting. I started reading to review a book called Underground Asia, a wonderful book, brilliantly written work of comparative history of the early 20th century. And it's by a historian at Cambridge named Tim Harper, who's a specialist in Southeast Asia, but started getting interested in these connections between Southeast Asian activists and Chinese activists and others. And he writes about this kind of interconnected world of activists from different parts of East and Southeast Asia who thought of themselves as having a common concern in that they came from either lost countries, was a term that would be used for ones that had fallen under colonial domination, or ones that seemed in danger of becoming lost countries. And so there were connections between these activists. They would meet up and exchange tracts in port cities along Southeast Asia and East Asia. They would have a sense of recognition when they started talking about what concerned them. In some cases, they would share a language. If they were suppressed by French colonialism, they might be able to communicate in French, even if their vernacular languages were completely different. If they were subsumed by British imperialism, they might be able to communicate in English. If they were coming under American control, as the Philippines were, they might also have that kind of shared English. If they were from different parts of East Asia, they might not be able to speak to each other, but they could write in Chinese characters and share ideas with each other. And there were quite important connections between these different parts of Asia, both through the Comintern and through Leninism once it came in, but before then, earlier times. Sun Yat-sen met up with Philippine insurgents in Tokyo early in the 1900s, and then started swapping strategies and ideas and modes of thought. As I read about these activities in the early 20th century, with the early 21st century on my mind, I felt this sense of echoes in very different kinds of media and different ways of traveling. The ways in which the Milk Tea Alliance has emerged has largely been among people who haven't physically met each other, but have met each other online. When they have a shared language that they can talk, it's often because of an engagement with the global popular culture of English. When they've had shared symbols, it might be something like the Hunger Games symbol that's shared via Hollywood or via global popular culture. So the mechanisms are different, but there are some kinds of parallels. I was curious about, and I've made a couple of other preliminary research trips to try to tease out how these connections are formed and how deep they go. There is no place like Paris where, because there was a treaty being formed, and also because it was the center of an empire, it would draw people from different places of the world. That's not a place where people are interacting, but one place they're interacting, curiously enough, is in Oslo. There's the Oslo Freedom Forum, which is trying to create Oslo is partly because it's the Nobel Peace Prize has this kind of tradition of trying to connect people with certain kinds of shared concerns. It doesn't just bring activists from different parts of Asia. I went there earlier this year for their first in-person one in a while. And there were people from struggles in Africa, struggles in the Middle East, others, but it tries to bring people who are largely involved in nonviolent civil disobedience or desperate struggles against military authorities, and they try to have, they mostly celebrate young people. They try to get them to kind of share practices, share ideas, share tips for each other. and also have a kind of sense, provide with each other a sense that they're not alone, which is, I think, one of the other things that social media with the Milk Tea Alliance does, is it gives people a way of continuing. So that's one of the things. And the last thing I'll say, because I really want to get questions, I can go much more deeply into the Hong Kong part of this. I only have very preliminary senses of the other settings, though I can tell you how I think there have been some connections that we've probably overlooked in recent history between a sense of shared concerns as well. But I think the last thing I would say is that there's a logic to activists trying to learn from each other in these settings, because in a time of increasing authoritarianism in many different parts of the world, there's a clear sense in which authoritarian governments are studying each other's techniques a great deal and borrowing each other's techniques. They're borrowing each other's techniques when they're formal allies, and they're borrowing each other's techniques when they are actually not allies at all. There's a way in which one of the best recent books on Xinjiang, the war on the Uyghurs, talks about how the Chinese Communist Party was intensely aware of the war on terror being carried out by the United States, and the rhetoric being used was then adapted as something that could be used in policies in Xinjiang. So even when I think we should realize that there's a way in which tactics can be shared even among people who aren't directly connected and may have very different goals. But I think that is happening from the top down with ideas of repression, and it's happening to some extent bottom up with the kinds of patterns of resistance. So I'll leave it there, being more suggestive, I hope, than anything else, but I'm happy to go into more deeply any of the things that I've passed, and I'm here to learn more than to teach. So I look forward to any questions and comments.
Well, thanks very much for that, Jeff. A really big sweep. I think a lot of us are interested in what you've actually, the latest things you've learnt on this current swing, which I understand is sort of fairly recent. So you probably have a long way to go, but you've had some interesting meetings in America and now here. I presume, were you in Taiwan or elsewhere? So
I haven't been to Taiwan yet. I want to go there. I'm hoping the quarantine gets a little bit shorter and I can go there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure Nancy Pelosi is forging away. But anyway, you might, or otherwise maybe people from the floor. I'm sure there's lots of questions here, but perhaps do you want to maybe cast a bit of light on recent?
Yeah.
Given that this is, a new tack you're taking.
Yeah. So I've been doing some interviews before coming here. I've done some interviews in the United States with Burmese in exile, and I've also been. I've always been interested in the transmission between generations. So I've also been going back and meeting, particularly with one of the Tiananmen activists who I know, and trying to think about in the 1988 in Burma and 1989 in China, these were not connected, but they were similar in time. There's an activist from 1988 who ended up coming to the United States and did a senior thesis with me as one of his advisors on the topic of comparing the Burmese uprising of 1988 and the massacre and the Tiananmen uprising of 1989 and the massacre, and trying to figure out if there were similar things. I mean, there were some connected things. There were very different kinds of movements. But I've interviewed, going back now with this interest in connection, and one of the things when I was talking to the student who worked with me, I said, so what was on your mind? What were the kinds of things that provided you with models for, what were you talking about as a teenager getting involved in this movement? And he said, well, in Yangon tea houses at that time, one of the things that people were talking about a lot was the Philippines, the people power movement there. It was something that there was an awareness of something that had happened that seemed extraordinary, of what had seemed a very firmly rooted dictatorship, and it had been overcome. And when I went back and then talked to one of the Tiananmen activists, I said, so how relevant was the Philippines for your generation? And she said, well, it's incredibly important. But it's something that I think both of them thought was so obvious, but it's actually not something that shows up in the memoirs when you're doing. So it's kind of like, how do people think of what is possible? And this is actually one of the themes that I want to write about in the tentative title of the book that I'm writing, which is going to be for the same series of very short books that Vigil's in. And it will be a kind of sequel, but moving internationally. But the kind of question that is in, how do people think of what might be possible? Because I think it's very important. If you get people on the street, you have to have some idea that even though the odds are incredibly stacked against you, it could work somehow. So how do people get that sense that something could work? And how do you stick with a movement after it reaches a kind of brick wall? And I think part of the working hypothesis that some of the interviews suggest is that one of the things that's important, and this explains why a figure like Havel and Mandela can be so important, is that there's an awareness that sometimes things have worked, and you can take some inspiration. You can also take inspiration at times, though, from the bravery of people in moments that it's not working. And so when I mentioned that early case in China in the 19-teens, the Korean movement had been brutally suppressed. But in some level, that helped inspire the figures in Shanghai and Beijing to protest, because there was something so inspiring about the bravery. And so I think there's a way in which, in a curious way, hope can be kept alive by what seem to be really, which are very dark experiences. And so I think the Hong Kong activists in exile I've been talking to are saying they're now becoming much more interested, some of them, and wish they had been more interested before in the Tibetan struggles. Because there's an example in Tibet where the movement has only been able to exist really it's been in a very desperate state within Tibet, but it's been existing in exile. So one of the questions of the Milk Tea Alliance is, does that include Tibet, which also drinks milk tea, as a place for that? So I've been talking to people who've lived through different stages of these movements, and also now talking to Hong Kong activists in exile, and I've begun to talk to Thai activists to try to get some sense of this as well. And I think what's emerging is very tentatively the things that keep hope alive, even in moments of many setbacks, are in some cases, at least in the Hong Kong case, and this is important, and I think scholars don't pay as much attention to it often. I think it's been a blind spot for me. Religious faith can be something that keeps it alive, and actual Christian groups were quite important. Christian true believers were some of the activists in Hong Kong. That gives you an idea that there's a shape to the universe that can move in a direction that may ultimately, even if there's a setback. That's been important in the United States and civil rights movements at different times as well. There's another way that can keep it alive, is simply that your friends or your sense of a community is shaped by the movement, so that even when the movement's defeated, you have a shared sense in exile or wherever of a shared sense of solidarity or community. And that can be something that's a shared sense between different parts of the world. And that's why, even if the Milk Tea Alliance doesn't actually have much teeth to it in a pragmatic sense, it may be important to people in these disparate places to simply be able to think of a wider community that have shared goals. I do think, though, there's a balancing act between the importance of awareness of other parts of the world and other parts of the present, but also in each case there is a sense of a connection to brave or tragic events in their own national past. So I think one of the things is that's I think emerging as a shared sense among activists in different parts of this alliance, is a shared sense both of a connection at the present to people in other places, and a connection between what they're doing and things that have happened in the past within their own geographical setting.
Right. Oh, thanks for that. Now, I've got a string of questions, but I would encourage people on the floor, if you do want to ask, just go up to the microphone. But meanwhile, can I just pick up on one of your earlier points, which I thought was interesting, mentioning Philippines. And sorry, I agree with you. It's really not widely mentioned as an inspiration, but actually, is there some kind of irony in the fact that, well, I covered the Philippines in the 1980s to date myself, and as you well know, also in Thailand earlier on, the inspiration for both those kind of revolutionary movements was the Chinese communism, right?
Yeah,
so isn't there a sort of huge irony that back then that was the inspiration for the revolutionaries back then, and now it's sort of the target of it's the inspiration in a negative sense. How does that morph? I mean, you know.
It's an incredible irony, and there's also the irony within Chinese history, which is that what linked a lot of the much earlier movements through the early 20th century was a common worry about the emergence of the Japanese Empire, and about 100 years later, you have. This is something that the Chinese Communist Party narrative is that everything that the glory of the 1949 revolution was finally leaving behind the whole period of empires, but the last empire that had been fought was the Japanese Empire, which had this term Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was an idea that it was not going to be like Western empires in the sense of taking over other places, but it would instead work to have congenial places that would stay autonomous. And in fact, there was a strong anti-imperialist rhetoric to the Japanese Empire. And so when I see the phrase for Hong Kong being used as the Greater Bay Area, and here, you will have you will be able to still be your partly autonomous Hong Kong, but you will be part of this region that benefits from each other. It has sort of a twisted ego. But I want to make something very clear about this when I talk about, because I think this is very, very important, especially in a sense in a time of rising tensions between China and the United States. The same kind of irony can be said about the United States at an earlier period of our history. That we had a rhetoric that was the United States was founded in this rejection of empire, rejection of the British Empire. And if you bring in the Philippines, the Spanish-American War was about freeing parts of the Caribbean and then the Philippines from imperialist domination, from being part of this old bad empire. And then quite soon after, what you had was some Americans saying, well, we should have an empire, but we just have a more enlightened one. And others saying, no, we won't have an empire, but we will bring these places under our control. So I do feel there's also the irony of the parallels between the United States about 100 years ago and Japan about 100 years ago and China now, emerging that way.
Yeah, I think that neatly ties it together. We might return to that theme. We've got a few questions. I think, Eugene, you're first. Please identify yourself.
Hello, I'm Yevgeny Belenky from a Russian media outlet here in Bangkok. Well, I'm following up to the previous question, actually. And my question is very short and I think very clear. Where do you see the next Comintern? Like, not a communist Comintern, but a pro-democratic sort of union, some center from which these movements could be supported?
That's a great question. I don't see one. I do think that the all right. So there's one other thing, sort of separate from the story of the Milk Tea Alliance. There's another set of we're living in a moment right now where the other big issue that we're confronting is climate change, and there is a shared sense of connectedness between youth involved in these very different parts of the world. I think the hope might be something Comintern-like that would be focused around the idea of saving the planet. There isn't a structure yet for that, but you started to see elements of it showing up in kind of climate strike things in different places. Joshua Wong and Greta Thunberg follow each other on social media, praise each other on social media. And I think what connects that in a curious way is not geography, but quite specifically generation. A sense of an older generation having been done too little and leaving things too late, and being part of a generation that will have to live much of their life rather than just a small part of their life with the consequences of it. So I think if there's a big idea out there, like, I do think countering imperialism was the big idea. And I think, to bring in Russian history, I think as much as the default mode is to talk about the appeal of Marxism, Leninism around the world. But the way really that, and I think we can see this in the Chinese case quite clearly, it really was the Leninist addition to Marxism that had the global reach. Yes, there was class struggle, resonated in different places, but what really resonated was Lenin's idea that comparable to the repression of the powerful classes to the less powerful classes was the powerful countries to the less powerful countries. And that was something that could allow people in really different parts of the world to say that there was a shared appeal to that, to the anti-imperialism. So I don't think the structure's there, but I think the comparable issue to empire at that point being the kind of common enemy would be climate change and the failure to deal with it effectively.
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you. Panu.
Hi, Professor Panu Wongcheum, club president and also Reuters reporter. My question is two-part, actually. It's very fascinating, and first of all, thank you so much for speaking. The first is, in your research into the recent transmission of Milk Tea Alliance protest idea, do you pay attention to the other side of the coin, the transmission of the way that different authoritarian regimes ridicule protesters and whatnot? And the second part, of course, is there echo of that in the past? I mean, beyond the use of brutal forces, the justification, or what we say nowadays is conspiracy theorists or fake news or whatever. I mean, is that like a new globalized thing, or in the past was there an echo of that as well? Thank you.
Wow, great question. Yeah, I love that question. So I'll give a shout out now for what I think is one of the best books written in the last dozen years that I don't think ever got the attention it deserved, by a guy named William Dobson, and it's called The Dictator's Learning Curve. And it came out in, I think, 2012. I mean, it was partly in the wake of Arab Spring, and he was precisely what he saw was emerging ideologically different authoritarian regimes that were developing a common playbook. And he used Chavez's, so he had the three places he had was Putin's Russia, Chavez, and China. And he said, these are three different ideological areas, but if you look at the strategies being used for dissidents, I mean, it was quite, he had done reporting in these places. He actually had a China background. He was then an editor for Newsweek International, and then he went to Slate, and now he's the editor of Journal of Democracy. But he had this, but he did some reporting, and he did reporting on Arab Spring. So he was very interested in Arab Spring, the flow up, but also the authoritarians flow down. And he became very interested in a group that had helped bring down Milosevic in that was then putting on workshops for activists in different places, and said, we can't tell you what works. We can't tell you what will work in your setting, but there are certain patterns that work, including using humor to mock what was going on. When I wrote a criticism of the book, I wrote a praiseful review of the book, but I said I didn't think China fit his model because the other places, he said, had a charismatic figure, and China had moved completely away from charismatic rule. So his book, ironically, has become more apt in the Xi Jinping era, even though he was writing about the Hu Jintao era. So there is, I think, this borrowing, and as I say, I think the spread of facial recognition software and the uses in different places of this, and securitization is clearly something that's going on. But there are cases both where there are allies that are, training each other. This is things have happened, but I think the idea that actually it's not new, like anything else. I think the British and French colonial authorities were so one of the things you did was you wanted to say your empire was different from the other empires, but you also wanted to use a lot of the techniques that the other empires were using. So thank you very much for that question. Another good one.
You're all feeding off it. Elaine.
Hi, Elaine Kurtenbach, Associated Press. I was interested in your thoughts about how the institutions themselves that the protesters are trying to change influence the movements themselves. For example, the most recent example being, in my mind, in Sri Lanka, you have a fairly problematic but well-established democracy. Last week, they kind of dodged a bullet in a way by settling things down, at least for now, unless maybe things blew up this morning. I don't know. Whereas in Myanmar, you had progress toward a democracy, but the institutions were so weak that it just fell apart. I mean, and there was a strong military as well. So I'm just a little bit interested in your thoughts on that.
That's a great, I think that's actually, I don't have an answer for that, but I think that's actually really valuable for me to think about, because I do think that one of the, I think it's very hard to be attuned enough to that there's a tendency to, if things look similar, we think that they're that we can put them into the same kind of category, and so there was the feeling when Burma, when Aung San Suu Kyi was out, it was like a complete corner had turned, rather than to be sufficiently aware to how weak the structures their structures were. Hong Kong, the challenge is that the structures actually seem to be quite strong, and yet we've seen the dismantling of them, of what had seemed strong. The other thing that I do think is an important variable, besides the internal structures, is how robust or how much attention the world has to put pressure when something happens. And so when we have a lot of changes, and we think that they're because the movement was better. It may not be that the movement was more effective. It was just that the global situation was such to allow it to happen. They're very fluky things. When so sometimes it can be as crucial as in the 1989 situation in Eastern and Central Europe, it could very easily have turned into another period of crackdown. But Gorbachev made a difference simply by sending signals that he wasn't going to be backing, say, an East German crackdown the way that his predecessors had supported crackdowns other ways. So I think one variable is the strength of the institutions, but another variable is the kind of global thing. How much, there were certain points when the United States simply lost its appetite for fully backing strongmen that it had helped to place in power, and its running out of patience helped provide the space for a movement to grow. So sociologists talk about a sort of political opportunities structure. I mean, you have to have, what is it that allows the ability for a movement to grow? And it can be a division within the elite within a setting, which seems to have been key in China with Tiananmen. It can be that there's the international cost that the regime would pay for repressing it too harshly. That can at least put a check on the way that the opponents of a movement respond. And I do think in 2014 there was a check on how brutal the crackdown on the umbrella movement could be, because there would have been a price paid. If the national security law had been suddenly imposed then, there would have been a very different kind of global response. COVID provided a kind of cover for an ability for an impatient Beijing to do something knowing that there wouldn't be that big a cost to pay. Thanks.
Thank you. Michael.
Thank you very much for the briefing. My name is... Hello, yeah. My name is Michael and I'm from Hong Kong. So a lot of my friends or Hong Kong people have recently feel very pessimistic, or that they think the 2019 protest movement was a total failure. I mean, looking at Hong Kong now, like the activists are all jailed or in exile. Speech freedom is more limited now, and also even the democratic economy now is also being cracked down by all the COVID-19 restrictions in Hong Kong. So how would you comment on this, or how would you determine whether a protest movement is actually successful or not? Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that I would say that there are different kinds of success, and so in fact, I think the Hong Kong movement was successful in the sense of being generative of imagery and of tactics. It was, in some ways, it added more to the global scene of protest than I think the Tiananmen protests did, for example, which was also a failure. But I would say, in a different way, I would actually say that the Tiananmen protests were a success in a different way in the short term. So maybe it's getting off topic, but I think it's kind of interesting this way. The protesters who took to the streets in Tiananmen during 1989, their goal was not to end Communist Party rule. Their goal, they had a variety of things. I would boil it down to, they were very critical of corruption, but they also wanted to have more choices in their life. They wanted to have more choices in their private life. They wanted to be able to listen to the music that they liked to listen to. They wanted to be part of global youth culture. They were frustrated because the 86 students that I watched protest, I wasn't there in 89, but I spent a lot of time talking to them. If you summed it up, they said, like, China is moving forward in a way, it's opening up, but it's opening up too slowly. We want it to liberalize faster and open up faster. When the movement was crushed brutally, a few years later, the regime wanted so much to avoid having to face that again that they actually gave the next generation, or this generation, that generation of students, many of the things they desired in terms of choices in their private life and their personal life. So the Tiananmen movement, in a very weird way, it was crushed, but some of the things that people on the campuses in the 1980s said, we wished we lived on a campus where the state wasn't trying to tell us what job we should go into, wasn't trying to interfere with who we dated, wouldn't want to interfere with our being able to listen to the music that people our age around the world are listening to. By the mid-1990s, a lot of Chinese students had they wanted to be able to travel more. So they actually, in a sense, that was a failure that succeeded, that got some of its goals. The Hong Kong movement is kind of the opposite. The goal, not only were the goals that they wanted, like true democracy for choosing, those were all crushed, but they've lost many of the things that they valued about their life within their country. But the success, or at least the things you can derive hope from, are being inspiring to people in other struggles. And also, I think that this sense of a distinctive Hong Kong identity is now flourishing outside of Hong Kong. So I think there's a way in which, this is just in the small world of academia, there's more energy being put into studying what makes Hong Kong distinct at the very moment when its culture is under such threat. The Hong Kong studies is actually flourishing in a way that it didn't before then. So if you wanted to say that one thing about the movement was to celebrate what made Hong Kong special, in Hong Kong that's being largely battered, but outside of Hong Kong it's flourishing. So that's what I say.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thanks, Jeff, for giving a speech here today. I'm Alvin, and I'm just a random immigrant to Australia. I try to escape China, what happened in Hong Kong. You just raise up the multi-alliance. It's a good idea, but everyone wants to see the vision. So, how you see the future of multi-alliance? Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks for that.
Good question.
Yeah, very
Let's
good.
Bring it down to the bottom line.
Very bottom. I don't see it as a. I don't see kind of strong organized movement, because in fact things are so different in different places. But I do see a potential future for the continuing kind of mutual awareness of different places, and I think actually you can take elements of it. I think that sort of that awareness. So I think the idea of trying to look for solidarities between very different struggles is something that that I hope keeps alive. Because again, if the opponents of these kinds of freedoms are learning from each other, it's just sort of foolish to not be. So I think there's the biggest value of it potentially is getting outside of the parochialism of being so focused on your own individual concerns that you're not aware enough of other places. So I think that's I think if there's a hope, it's outside of the kind of geographical territory of Milk Tea Alliance, but almost a kind of spirit. And I think this is happening even within the Milk Tea Alliance per se. The activists who are trying to keep that spirit alive are now talking a lot about Ukraine. Which is not a place with milk tea. Yeah. So I think that might be one of the things to think about. And so, there's a limitation of the idea of, even just the term milk tea. But I think the hopefulness of some kind of borrowing of looking for inspiration in generational lines, I mean, maybe that would be the way to think about it. I know within the study of the people who are talking about the Thai activism are talking largely about Gen Zers or Gen Z, and that would be something to think about. And if you study youth movements for a while, one of the things that you quite quickly realize is there's a recurring pattern of people saying that a current generation of youth just aren't as political, aren't going to accomplish things that a great, glorious generation of the past accomplished. And that was said on Chinese campuses in the mid-1980s, right before the Tiananmen protests. People were telling me, it's too bad you're studying youth movements, because this generation, all they want to do is perm their hair and listen to rock music. They're not going to, and then suddenly they're on the streets. In the United States, a few years ago, there was a discussion that teenagers, they're all just looking at their phones. They're all so self-absorbed. There's not going to be any kind of, don't expect anything from them in terms of activism. And then it didn't it didn't continue, but after the Parkland shootings, there was the biggest youth organized protest of calling for gun control. There was a really big demonstration in Washington, D.C. by teenagers who were precisely in that generation that were dismissed as being kind of apathetic. So I guess I have that sneaking hope for some kind of idea that actually an element of youth activism keeps showing up again in different places. And I think we saw it with the climate strike in Europe. It's not coalescing at the moment. So that's why something like the Milk Tea Alliance, where there is a coalescence between at least a couple of places, looks inspiring. But I think that would be the thing to keep watching if there's a more of an increased generational awareness. And I do think the environment is the thing that is going to knit people together, if anything will.
An interesting point. So, Jeff, a final question, I think, is about your book, your new book. What's your timing, and what is actually your main point?
The timing, I can tell you, it's quite dramatic. I mean, so I want to emphasize, these are really, really short books. There's an audio version, and you can listen to the whole audio version in less time than you can watch Martin Scorsese's last movie. So it's very short. So it's going to be written very quickly. So I have to have it done by May of next year. So it is going to be short. The working title is Impossible Dreamers. And so the theme in it is going to be precisely this, how do people stick with movements after they've had many kind of setbacks? And are there shared patterns that lead to that? And this is relevant for, this is relevant far outside of the region, because what we're looking at, and the Philippines is a great example of this, we're looking at all kinds of places where things that we thought we had moved beyond are kind of back with a vengeance. And so you have this in the United States. You have people who fought for civil rights, and they thought they had won a battle, and now they're looking at a kind of, a backsliding. So the idea of like, how do you psychologically stick with a struggle? And I do think that faith is a big part of it, and it can be religious faith, or going back to the Comintern, it can be ideological faith, a belief system that says that the arc of the universe bends ultimately toward justice or toward change. Margaret Atwood was recently asked, what did she think of Martin Luther King's claim that the arc of the universe bends toward justice? And she says, it's a beautiful idea, it's just wrong. It's just not true. But I think one way that people stick with it is a kind of faith of one sort or another. Another is a kind of a sense of community, of kinship. Another is that it's simply that's how you've defined your self-identity. And another is that you just couldn't live with yourself if you didn't fight. And this is something that's keeping the Hong Kong activists in diaspora alive, is they feel, some of them feel a kind of survivor's guilt, is that if people who've stayed behind are in jail or risking jail, how can they not keep part of this movement, even though there really is? I don't see a scenario where it succeeds. But on the other hand, at different points in Havel's life and Mandela's life, in any anti-colonialist struggle's life, you would say, why do you believe? And this is this book, Underground Asia, that I mentioned. It's fine. You can tell the story of a Ho Chi Minh who lives to see the end of French imperialism, of a Gandhi who lives to see, at least on the horizon, the end of British imperialism. But he talks about a lot of other figures who spent their whole life in causes and died in causes that did not succeed. And I'll just mention one other thing from his book, because I think it brought home this idea. He has an anecdote about a Vietnamese activist who goes to southern China and is trying to assassinate a French colonial official and becomes a martyr. And then he's buried in the graveyard that's for the heroes of the Chinese Revolution. So there was a sense of this kind of shared mission could be something that had a tangible feeling. And so that too, if you think of sort of what can allow some kind of hope in these very hopeless situations, if you feel that there are other people struggling against even greater odds, that can be something that keeps you going. And so it's an odd, talking about ironies of dynamics, you can imagine that there are ways in which I've had people who were part of Eastern European protests in 1989 said, we drew so much inspiration from what happened in Tiananmen Square. And I'm saying, like, okay, you're at a place, you've just seen the state crack down on this. And they said, yes, but I wanted to be like the people who were brave enough to do that. So that's another way in which a failed movement can have some degree of success.
Yeah, well then there's all Arab Spring, Egypt,
Yes.
Tahrir Square and all that.
Yeah.
We haven't really discussed Middle East, but I think we'll try and stick to Asia for this.
But no, it's very much in my mind. And in fact, there's there's a group at the University of California, Global Hong Kong Studies at UC, that's had a series of events about Hong Kong, including showing films, online, all of this virtually between the campuses. But they had a book exercise, and they wanted to meet with an author about a book, and they chose as the book to focus on a book about the Arab Spring abroad, that's specifically about the role of the diaspora communities in spreading information during Arab Spring. And it was like that book had nothing to do with Hong Kong, but a feeling that it was something that actually they should be looking at because it would give you ideas about that. And yeah, I'm thinking a lot about Arab Spring when I'm thinking about Milk Tea Alliance, because in fact, the connections between different parts of that weren't necessarily that strong, but there was an awareness of it that helped give people some courage or ideas or inspiration.
You mean around the world, or
Around-
you mean
Around the world, but that was around a region. That was not, if you said, was there an Arab Spring movement? Not really, not at least as far as I can tell. There were some people involved in these for purely local reasons, but an awareness of what was that something similar was happening someplace else helped drive it forward.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, yes, and Myanmar is another case with a huge diaspora.
Yes, yes.
But unfortunately, a lot of the world has forgotten Myanmar. I think much of a different dimension to Hong Kong.
I'll just mention
And Thailand.
one of the only hopeful things, because Myanmar is such a distressing situation. But I did speak to I carried out one of the interviews with a long-time Myanmar activist, and she said that one thing she was hopeful about was that that the current regime seemed to be doing things so badly that there was a minimizing of inter-ethnic tensions because there was such a clear enemy.
Right.
And
Self-reinforcing.
and that isn't happening. The Chinese case, that's not happening. But there is certainly, if you want to look at there is more. I mean, there's more mutual awareness and discussion between Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibetan activists in exile now, because there is a sense of a kind of a regime that's sort of showing its colors in a way that it hadn't before. Right. If even Hong Kong, a place with a Han Chinese population, is having to deal with this.
Right.
That it so if you're looking desperately for sources of kind of hope, that maybe there are some moments when tensions though exile communities often feud within themselves, so there's a whole different way in which that can tear apart. But I was really struck by two things in the interviews that I've done so far with people in the United States with long-term ties to Burma. One was this idea of a possible lessening of inter-ethnic tensions, and the other was just by somebody who lived through the '88 movement, lived through the excitement of being able to reconnect with his family in the 2010s, and now is living through this such discouraging thing, but he's trying to raise awareness in the U.S., keep it alive. And he wrote to me in an email, I feel helpless but not hopeless.
Yeah. Right.
And I felt that was inspiring to me.
Right. And I think really the Myanmar example, possibly the Han Chinese of the Myanmar movement are the Burma,
Yeah.
who actually talking about reduction of inter-ethnic tensions, but actually now that you've got the majority Burma also feeling the same way, that solidarity is actually...
And the person I mentioned who I've known this long, he's now in an area with a large Karen population
Like
in
so many
exile,
of them,
and he's doing oral history projects with them and connecting, probably having more interaction with Karen people than he's ever had in his life. So, yeah.
Well, it's got to lead somewhere.
Yeah.
So with that, I'd really... Oh, one more from a Myanmar friend.
Yeah, I'm Pamwi. I'm Pamwi, an editor of Molotov newsletter, which is an underground publication in Burma. And my question is, firstly, I like the fact that you mentioned that recurrent pattern of protest throughout the history. And my question is do you have any comment? And I want to know, if possible, your idea about current days protest movements around the region, because mostly some of them are dependent on digitally and through social media. And my question is, do you think does the impact of netizen through the region and throughout the global has an effect on the current protests, current activities based on social issues, from social issues to democracy, political things? Do you think that kind of protest online, especially when the netizen, have an impact on the reality, and does that tend to any change?
Great question.
Thank you.
I think the complexity with digital media is that it both strengthens the ability for activists to connect in different parts of the world and share information and things, but it also increases the ability of the state to repress activists. So I think each new medium of communication has had these dual effects through history. It both contributes to resistance and it contributes to control. And so I think we've seen that, that the Hong Kong movement had the kind of power that it had in getting people on the street because of the ability to be tightly connected and communicate in new ways. But the state apparatus, the repression, has been using these forms of technology to crack down as well. So it's very it's that dual thing. It both can spread awareness and also keep surveillance. So that's the strange thing about this moment. And it's not the first time that technologies that way have worked that way, but it's working with a great power now. It's also there's a new book called The Quiet Before that's by a guy named Gal Beckerman, which is a very interesting book about trying to figure out how new media, how media through time has changed, or how do new ways of thinking and he makes a real argument that what really brings about meaningful, lasting new ideas are conversations that are actually kind of slow in building and take place often face to face, and that new media makes it easy to do something dramatic quickly, to get a lot of people out onto the street, but makes it harder to create the kinds of things that have really long-term lasting power, which is an interesting thing. I mean, we can't test it yet, but I think he's right in both. I think he's right about it does speed with which you can get people onto the street, but whether it can then, it may lead to the situation of weaker institutional things afterwards. And he uses as the example that with Arab Spring was one of the first things that new media got people onto the streets, and people really, it was called the Facebook or Twitter revolution, or one of my colleagues from the region said it should have been called the Al Jazeera Revolution because it was people seeing what other people were doing gave them ideas. But change came really quickly because of the giant crowds, but there weren't the kind of sustained building of civil society that could allow a longer, there could very quickly be just a new authoritarian coming in. So I think that's a kind of tempering lesson for it.
Right, and I think in that respect, Hong Kong picked up the momentum, and then Thailand really perfected it with flash mob.
Right.
Flash mob messaging that would bring, crowds onto the streets within minutes. But where did it end up?
And and there's a question of that in the United States now, there are ways in which there can be very quick with Black Lives Matter or the Women's March after Trump. But then does this lead to, what is it that, there's both of that. He actually has a chapter about Black Lives Matter, but so I think it's both. I think it's the challenge for movements is to figure out how to make the most of the flash mob kind of thing and also still put in the work to build the kind of things that are sustainable.
Right.
And can continue even during long periods of repression, which happened in, say, Eastern Europe when there was a long period between movements, but people managed to find sometimes quite subtle ways to keep things alive.
Except you mentioned imagery before, and if your aim is to get iconic images that last and are reprinted, I think a flash mob is very, serves that purpose.
You have to. Yeah.
Anyway, so I'd just like to thank Jeff for a great talk, and thank you all for turning up at lunchtime. I think we'll post this video on our Facebook page as well if you want to share it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. It's really valuable to be able to get questions like this at this early stage, premature stage of the talk.
It's helping craft.
Oh,
the
yeah.
See, you all had a share in it.
In the acknowledgements. Yes, I can.